All right. Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm Margot Weiss. I'm an associate professor of American Studies and Anthropology and director of queer studies at Wesleyan University. And with Debanuj DasGupta, who's an associate professor of feminist studies at UC Santa Barbara, I put together this roundtable to honor and celebrate Amber Holibaugh's crucial analysis of how, as she put it, queer issues are class issues. Now, if you don't know Amber, and maybe everybody in this room already does, she was a self-described radical ex-hooker, incest survivor, rural gypsy, working class, poor white trash, high femme dyke, and a lifelong organizer and public intellectual. She was born dirt poor in Bakersfield, California, and left home at 15. She organized with the Civil Rights Movement and the Revolutionary Left, SNCC and the United Farm Workers inside prisons, and with draft dodgers. Her political CV touches on every major social movement since the 60s: gay liberation, women's liberation, HIV/AIDS, and LGBT elders. And in this work, she always centered class and desire, campaigning against the Briggs Initiative in union halls across rural California, for instance, or doing AIDS work in prisons, shelters, and SROs, eventually creating the Lesbian AIDS Project at the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City. And unlike most upper middle class radicals, in her early years, she supported herself through sex work. As a high femme lesbian hooker and a commie dyke organizer, she recalled, politically radical lesbians or women's liberationists lived in one stratosphere. Working class femmes and hookers lived in another. I appeared to be the only person straddling both. Although I had met Amber before and had been inspired by her written work when I first read What We're Rolling Around in Bed With in college, a very long time ago, I truly got to know her the day I walked into Queers for Economic Justice's Chelsea office to volunteer. Amber was one of QEJ's co-founders and its last executive director, and I was lucky to work with her during QEJ's final 2 years of operation. Amber and QEJ are at the center of a book I'm writing now about pedagogy and desire in queer left activism in the long 2000s, and I am extraordinarily lucky to have been able to learn from and collaborate with her. I am grateful for that daily education in how queer issues are always class issues, and why sex politics must center poor people, and most of all, in that desire, both political and erotic, is an essential component of liberation. So today's roundtable, for me, honors what is both a political and an intellectual debt to Amber. Amber was the first person in her family to graduate from high school, and she never lost the sense that academia, or the world of ideas, was not meant for her. The left was my college, she once said. I took that Marxism and class politics into the women's movement, into the queer movement, into the AIDS movement. And although Amber is influential among activists and celebrated among a certain set of us academics, she has not, at least in my reading, received her due as a theorist of desire and erotics. Queer studies, we hear again and again, ignores class. Marxist analysis is all but absent from queer theory. But this, of course, is just one genealogy, and one that screens out the contributions Amber and other activists and public intellectuals have made to a different kind of queer class studies. This roundtable features an all-star lineup of some of Amber's fellow travelers and colleagues, gathered to celebrate Amber's insights and consider her lasting legacy. Panelists were each invited to share a brief comment about how Amber's work inspired their own or intersects with their own. Amber's political work began in the 60s. She made major left interventions in the feminist sex wars, the homonormative 90s, and the queer multicultural neoliberal 2000s. Perhaps collectively, we can consider what Amber's work teaches us now as U.S. neoliberal multiculturalism tips into fascist authoritarianism. So first up, we'll hear from Lisa Duggan, a journalist, activist, and professor emeritus of social and cultural analysis at New York University. And next, Janet R. Jakobsen, Claire Tow Professor and Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College, Columbia University. Martin F. Manalansan IV, Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University, is next, followed by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinha, a non-binary femme disabled writer, disability and transformative justice cultural worker, and notorious hot bitch. Juana María Rodríguez, Professor of Ethnic Studies and Performance Studies at UC Berkeley, will follow Leah. And then Beck Jordan Young, a class migrant who directs the Barnard Center for Research on Women and is Ann Whitney Olin Professor of WGSS at Barnard College. And these are, of course, extremely abbreviated bios. We're told just to read like the top line of the bio for such luminaries. So please look at their full bios to read about their accomplishments. And then we'll end with a few framing thoughts from Debanuj, who will also take us into Q&A. So thanks so much for being here with us today. And Lisa, do you want to kick us off?
Hey. I want to start out by saying that Amber was part of a generational cohort of working class dykes who really transformed our movement in the 1980s. Working alongside people like Jewel Gomez, Cherie Moraga, Joan Nessel, and Dorothy Allison, the interventions that Amber made were made collectively by a group of really fierce activist intellectuals who shaped thinking and activism way beyond their numbers. And I want to pause before I start talking about Amber to just say briefly something about Dorothy Allison, who died of cancer in 2024. I think we haven't yet begun to honor Dorothy Allison, who is and was an enormous force and was a close friend and collaborated with Amber for decades. So I hope we'll see some more about Dorothy Allison. These writer and activists connected race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, age, and other social formations in viscerally compelling ways, arguing for and bringing in the everyday life of class into all these overlapping social movements. Bringing them all into all of our spaces and organizations. And Robin Kelly, I once heard say that, no one wants to be labor. People want to be part of a collective life that has a collective force that takes in the whole of life, joy, desire, sadness, grief, as well as intellect and politics and mobilization. And Amber really understood that and was a catalyst for bringing that kind of force into politics. I've worked with Amber for over 4 decades through a series of different movements. She was a writer, filmmaker, organizer, but she was especially a mesmerizing speaker, kind of a killer speaker. It's you'd never want to follow Amber Hollibaugh. And the other thing, when she spoke and when she wrote and organized, she didn't treat class as an identity, as so many of us so often do. Think of a working class as an identity alongside of all of these other identities. Amber treated class as a dynamic set of relations and perspectives. And she brought it in as a way of rethinking the world and reshaping politics and ways of thinking about history, not just invoking inclusion on an identity basis. Here are some of the examples of the ways that I worked with Amber over time. I met her in 1979 at the Gay Socialist Salon up on the Upper West Side when she stomped in a pair of combat boots, otherwise high femme from the neck up and really combat dyke from the neck down, where she was talking about the kind of face-to-face organizing she did for the Briggs Initiative in California. The power of that kind of face-to-face organizing, I think, is something the Mamdani campaign also showed us with 100,000 volunteers. The importance of really speaking to people, being visibly present. One of the most intense periods during which I worked with Amber was during the 1980s sex wars and the notorious 1982 Barnard Conference. This set of relations was in which all of this entire cohort of working class dykes that I'm invoking were very present and active. Often the story is told as if they were not the key interventions in the sex wars. It was a key moment of transformation in which the working class dyke cohort and others came under actually ferocious attack for their take on sex work, explicit media, and sexual practices outside of the respectable norm. Very intense period in which Amber, as well as her comrades, were actually deeply hurt and had to fight a lot of attacks and pain that came from other feminists. It left its mark on the psyche, I think, of that entire cohort, who were often very personally attacked, as they were at the 1982 Barnard Conference. In 1990s, Amber moved on to work in HIV/AIDS, and as Margot said, she founded a lesbian AIDS project at GMHC. She worked at the Howard Brown Health Center, where she focused on lesbians, especially sex workers and injection drug users. During that time period, she made an award-winning film, 1984's The Heart of the Matter, and then she went on to write her amazing, evocative memoir, My Dangerous Desires, a queer girl dreaming her way home in 2000, where she spoke about this book and with people about this book all over the country. I saw her many times at various events, but I also want to single out an essay that partly came out of that book that has also had a really profound impact and that treats class in the way I was saying. It's called Queers Without Money. And it was published in the Village Voice in 2001. The Baffler reprinted it recently at 2022, and it really encapsulates the way Amber invoked the everyday life, the full spectrum of life experience that comes from a working class perspective, and not just making an argument about inclusion. In 2011, 2012, actually during that whole period, I worked with Amber in Queers for Economic Justice. And we published a little ebook in the Scholar and the Feminist Online, which I think Janet and Beck may have something to say, talk about. And in the New Queer Agenda, Amber's intervention with all of us was to make the argument that all issues that affect queer people are queer issues, and not just the issues that affect only queer people. For instance, the majority of working queer people cared more about immigration, police violence and incarceration, retirement income, child care, and other issues than about marriage equality. And in fact, she helped us, a group of us who put out a statement called Beyond Marriage with a large group of signers during that period. The last time I really went on a personal trip, event with Amber, we went to a conference in Hong Kong in 2013. And it was an international conference. It was incredibly stimulating. But then Amber went off to mainland China to meet meet with sex workers trying to organize in mainland China. An incredibly difficult and not entirely legally permitted thing to have done. She went on after then to do her work at BCRW, working in survival economics and other projects there, which other speakers will talk about. But I really want to conclude with a quote that was pulled in a recent issue of Pinko. And they were publishing the transcript of the speech that Amber gave at the kind of mass crowd that gathered in San Francisco after the murder of Harvey Milk. And the quote is, "There is no human hope without the promise of ecstasy."
Hi, everybody. I'm Janet Jakobsen, and forgive me if I cough. I have very, very, very bad allergies right now, and I'm going to try to go back one slide. The crucial thing about this and about my bio is that I had the pleasure of serving as director of BCRW at Barnard College for 15 years and worked with Amber there. And the important thing about this title slide is bcrw.barnard.edu. In one way, it's very fortunate. I can't show you actual film clips because I just spent the last week watching Amber speak on film, and that's all we would be doing for like the next 6 hours. But I do encourage you to spend at least 6, if not more, hours of your time watching Amber at the BCRW. So this is Amber Hollibaugh. This is one of my favorite pictures of her. But one of the crucial points for today is that I actually did not meet Amber at Barnard, even though she was involved with the BCRW since the early 80s, long before I arrived. I met her instead at CLAGS. And so this is the Amber Hollibaugh Seminars in the City, sponsored by CLAGS. It's one of the great I don't know what to say, the gifts that Amber gave us, which is that when she left us, we were able to produce something in her honor through CLAGS, and the important place that CLAGS was for her. And so basically my whole talk is an ad for the Amber Hollibaugh Seminars in the City. But these stories of meeting are important, and so I want to go back and tell you the actual story. This is how it goes. Before I moved to New York, I was visiting my good friend Ann Pellegrini, who I often write with, who happened to be the chair of the CLAGS board at the time. And since there was a meeting and I was in town, Ann asked me if I wanted to come along. Yes, I am a nerd, so of course, when visiting New York, what else would I do besides go to a meeting? Nonetheless, it turned out to be one of the most important events of my life, which was that Amber was on the board at that time. And in conversation that day, there were clearly some key points on which our sensibilities converged. First, femme fabulousness. I was never a high femme, certainly not someone who could aspire to Amber's heights. So no lipstick for me, but nonetheless, short skirts, often see-through shirts, some high heels. Amber, later in life, always wore tennis shoes, so I, too, have had to follow her down that road. I've followed her down many roads. But this was a revelation to me in terms of the ability to be in certain academic spaces and carry on a high femme life. Second, the whole system has got to go. When I was a young organizer, I was doing anti-apartheid work in Washington, D.C., and I was quoted in a magazine which was called U.S. News and World Report, or as we called it, U.S. News and World Distort. But I did say what I thought was obvious at the time, which is that the whole system that supported apartheid, meaning capitalism, has to go. Apparently, this is still not obvious, neither the point about capitalism nor the point about apartheid. But Amber knew. Here she is, speaking at the BCRW. This is in one of the BCRW videos, and I believe this is a young Jen Levin over here in the corner. And what she says is, this is one of the quotes I will offer you, but I encourage you to watch the whole video. Quote, "Why don't you just commit to changing the whole world totally? Why don't you just not give up? Why don't you just decide that in your life you're not going to agree to less? Why not, indeed? Then, the third thing on which we agreed is the connections between thinking and organizing, activism and the academy, or what at BCRW is called scholarship and feminism. These connections were the basis of projects on which we got to collaborate, projects that depended on the idea that both thinking and organizing should happen in all different kinds of sites. So it was not an idea that scholarship happened in the academy and action happened in organizers, but rather that cross-pollination of different kinds of thinking and action from different sites could produce this total change to the world. Crucially, for our conference here on queer class relations, I think the sources for Amber's commitment to this idea include her own drives and desires, certainly, but also a social context of class organizing in which reading groups, often of highly theoretical texts, were combined with feminist consciousness raising, again of often highly theoretical texts, in which ideas and experience were purposefully brought together. And of course, Amber was a fabulous organizer and thinker and writer, and some of the main goals of the collaborative projects at the BCRW was to, for her, she wanted to articulate the place of queer living, and especially of desire, in a class-based feminist analysis that took work, and especially sex work, seriously. These projects included Desiring Change. This is from the inside cover of the report for that project, which was a series of workshops hosted by Amber at BCRW and an organizational survey undertaken by Serena Khan that asked how, quote, desire, the erotic, and sex work connected to organizations ranging from South Asian Network, the Latino Community Strategy Center, and the Dolores Huerta Project in LA, to the Audre Lorde Project, the Center for LGBTQ Issues, and QEJ here in New York. The point of the report, Desiring Change, which was written by Catherine Sammy, Amber, and myself, is that in Amber's words, quote, desire is an engine for social change. And this, one of the things, I mean, you can see from Lisa's quote as well, Amber's ability to crystallize something in words was just amazing. Desire is also a site of difference and expansiveness. Amber was dedicated to the idea that people desired all different kinds of things, and that one way to break through heteronormativity and homo-nationalism was simply to talk about these differences openly. Doing so could lead to more connected and more expansive movements for change. Here she is at the 40th Scholar and Feminist Conference on a plenary panel that was called Expanding Feminisms, and I like to think that her hand gestures here show the expansiveness of her vision for our movements and what might be possible. Amber brought a lot of this work together in a project called Queer Survival Economies, and you can also find many of the videos at queersurvivaleconomies.com, so some of the same ones that are on the BCRW site and others as well. The homepage for this project names Queer Survival Economies as Research, Build, Organize. Again, what more do we need to do? And it includes a quotation from a fabulous attitude which was produced by the Welfare Warriors Project at QEJ, which again says, queer issues are class issues. The project itself is described as follows. Queer Survival Economies is an initiative established in 2014 by Amber Hollibaugh to work at the intersections of sexuality, poverty, homelessness, labor, and the criminalization of survival. Among the many aspects of this project was a conference held again here at CUNY at the Murphy Center called Invisible Lives, Targeted Bodies, which was about the ways in which the needs of working people, and again, especially people who worked in criminalized survival activities, were not recognized. They were invisible, even as they, as individual people, were often targeted by the very state that denied them in every other way. This also produced an important essay by Margot and Amber that was published in New Left Forum, or New Labor Forum. If queer issues are class issues, this conference argued that we could learn from a focus on excluded workers, those cut out of labor protections, out of legal employment, including, of course, sex workers, and now we could say out of labor entirely, or even out of the U.S. in the midst of this contemporary program of mass deportation. The last project that I'll share with you, and there's a lot more, again, I encourage you to go to the BCRW website, was truly prescient and is like Desiring Change. This is from BCRW's new Feminist Solutions series, and it is a report, once again, crystallizing the point in its very title: immigrants and refugees are welcome here. And I hope you can make out the photo in the center. This is Amber, once again, smiling and laughing behind and marching behind the QEJ banner. So as you can see, we have much to learn from Amber Hollibaugh, and I encourage you to participate in, and if you can, contribute to Amber Hollibaugh seminars in the city. In other words, I would be failing her if I did not take this as an organizing opportunity. Because there is so much to learn, we can join together and try to create the expansive movement for social change that she imagined, a movement in which queer issues and class issues are class issues and class issues are queer issues, in which immigrants and refugees and sex workers and people with HIV and butch and femme and transgender and gender nonconforming people and all people of color and people without housing and people just trying to survive are welcome here. In order to get to this world, Amber would tell us that we need to think and we need to act, and perhaps most of all, we need to desire. Thank you.
I'm Martin Manalansan, and I'd like to thank Margot and Debanuj for gathering us together, a wonderful table of people I've known for a long time and I've admired, and also an opportunity to travel back to the 1990s, what my Gen Z students would call ancient history. It's true. I had the delightful opportunity of working with Amber Hollibaugh at the Gay Men's Health Crisis when I was there from 1989 to 1995. It was, and I think it's still standing somewhere in Chelsea, the long-standing and oldest private AIDS service agency, and I believe it still is in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. Amber was hired to be the founding director, as several people have said, founding director of the Lesbian AIDS Project. It is interesting at this point, particularly in the late 1980s, that it was definitely less of a gay white male disease and more of a disease of the marginal, the minoritarian communities, poor immigrant communities of color, and all that. The first challenge for Amber was to convince people that lesbians were part of the pandemic, that lesbians were at risk for AIDS through various vulnerable positions and behaviors. And the way to confront this challenge was to create a survey. At that time, I was coordinator of research at the agency, so a draft was sent to me for review. One of the things that I first noticed, because it was was a series of items for respondents to identify, in as many as they think is necessary, particular sites of where they have worked or lived in. So all of these, like tenements, garages, restaurants, red light districts, convents, prisons, all-girls schools, and all that. And that I was like, for a second prompt, I was like, Amber, what are you doing? And I realized, and we had that talk because at the end of the day, despite my confusion and because of my training, where I used to think of class and sexuality as these, separate prompts for a survey, she was insistent on what I would call a messy prompt, and the messiness that was productive in enlightening what essentially she was arguing was to think of class and sexuality not as separate entities, but to think of income or occupation or terms like lesbian, bisexual, or straight as points of inhabitation or sites of inhabitation, modes of life that cannot be calcified or packaged into ready-made categories. In other words, class and desire, as her autobiography reveals, and as many people have testified here, are intricately entangled. What I didn't appreciate then was the ways in which ordinary respondents would have confronted the typical questionnaire about class and sexual identity into things that were enclosed and not capacious. So going beyond the normative questions about educational attainment, annual salary, and class stratified categories, Amber's question or prompt showcased what I would call her undisciplined approach, which I admire and I think I follow today. By not forcing respondents to box their own preconceptions about their economic status and their sexual gender practices. There was something instructive in the ways in which she defined not only positivist social science research methodology, but rather to expose the productive possibilities of unbounding categories of class, sexual orientation, gender identity, and risk for HIV/AIDS. On a personal level, I appreciate Amber's buoyant and bright personality that countered the rather staid, boring Chelsea queens that I worked with. And as you can see, she had that smile. No one smiled in my office. Everyone was like butch as hell. That's why I didn't fit in. But, and I say this, she did light up a room, as you can see, and take it from me, I'm a gay man. I know beauty when I see it. She had a smile that light up a room, while at the same time, she could be very fierce. And to be in a meeting with these Chelsea queens is daunting because they can be adamant because most of the time they had the money. So she would have to say no. And she would say it defiantly, and I totally admired her for doing that. In arguing in front of, our donors were not just Chelsea queens, they were like millionaires, the Tish and all that, and she was totally poised and unafraid in proposing her ideas. On a personal level too, she had, through some conversations with her, a rather vexed relationship with the medical establishment. It's true. She actually told me that. I was like, oh, okay. But it was not, I mean, it was this vexed relationship, a kind of suspicion about the medical establishment. At first, you could see how it reflected the mood at that point with the Reagan administration and the CDC and all that. But more importantly, I think it was also part of her experience, a lifetime experience with having very limited access to medical care. She herself admitted that she was a rather recalcitrant patient, an attitude that reflected the mood at that time with AIDS activist organizations. More importantly, her own self-realized composure set her against a world that rendered her vulnerably invisible. We bonded for a bit, especially when I told her that I was an anthropology grad student. I was in ABD for 10 years. So, and I was like, yes, but anyway, let's not talk about that. That was the 90s. With an overdue dissertation, and she asked me if I knew her good friend, Esther Newton. I was excited to tell her that Esther was not only my informal mentor, since my own dissertation advisor did not think much about my topic of study, Filipino gay immigrants in New York City, but Esther's mother camp and her gentle guidance convinced me that a life as a queer anthropologist was indeed possible. So these intersections of people, friends of friends, are, fascinating, parts of our lives. By the time I finished my dissertation and began my professional career in the prairies of the Midwest, we lost touch until we met again at Esther Newton's Kessler lecture here at CLAGS. It was nice to see her again. And this roundtable compelled me to deeply appreciate Amber's enriching presence and legacy, not only in terms of my own personal and professional experience, but I think for so many of us here. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Leah. I want to shout out this Mean Scary Femme Appreciation Club sticker, which Amber would have fucking loved. And I'm just going to give a potpourri of stories about Amber. One of the first things I think of was we were at a convening of, one of the first convenings of queer and trans, black and brown organizations in Minnesota in like 2008. And I ran into her like we did over the years, and she was like, hey, doll, what's up? What are you doing? And I was like, what's going on with QEJ? And she's like, the problem is it's impossible to get foundations or rich people to give poor queers a grant when your goal is to end capitalism and to give people money so they can buy food. And I know people are laughing in recognition, but she was like, it's really not funny. Like, we're not trying to be a social service organization. We're trying to build poor queer power, right? I met Amber when I was 21 years old in 1996. I had been a part of HIV/AIDS work since I was 16 because the people that I was in love with and fucking were other young queer and trans kids who were trading sex for money and shooting drugs and living in a Rust Belt city or cities. And she always likes to tell the story that she was like, yeah, you walked into the lap office in a tiny slip and big boots and said you were sick of dealing with white gay men. And she was like, okay, doll, you're hired, you're my intern, go to 5 different subway stations and get all the tokens because the ladies from Rikers, who don't call themselves lesbians but really love their girlfriends, are coming over for the social on the roof, so we're gonna give them tokens and dental dams even though they really don't want dental dams. And that's not just a cute anecdote. Like, I really want to lift up Amber's specific femme organizing strategies and genius. Throughout her career as a writer and an organizer, I think a lot of people really identify and pull out the ways in which she wrote really beautifully about her attractions and relationships to butch and masculine of center people, and that's super real. But for me, she was also a femme's femme. Like, she looked out for other working class and poor femmes. And that didn't mean this kind of simple, like, oh, I love you, you're great. Like, she kicked our asses. Like, she really did in ways that we needed. She got me the second paid serious writer gig I ever got. And she looked at me as somebody else who was a mixed race, working class. Like, I was on a scholarship to NYU, I was fucking it up. Like survivor femme, who a lot of people were looking at as just some dumb slut who was not to be taken seriously. And she knew what it was like to be an absolutely brilliant working class genius and to be seen as a dumb slut who wasn't going to be taken seriously. And she was like, you know what? Like, actually, let's do some work together. I believe in you. And that's a working class femme organizing tactic. I have like 15 things to say in 8 minutes, so let's see how far we go. I don't know that Amber ever identified as disabled. Later on in our relationship, like, I was always trying to jump her into disability justice, and I was like, there's this thing, come on. And also, so many of us who are disability justice organizers and writers and people really have so much compassion for how many of our people are like, the D word is not worth it for me. Like, that's whiteness, that's stigma, that's, what do you mean, claim this thing? Like, I don't know. But I see in disability justice organizing, before and after that word was coined, a real reaching towards those of us who have been told that we are too stupid, too slutty, and too inconsequential to matter, that we get to be the clients, we don't get to be the organizers and the leaders, and saying, no, actually, you get to be the leaders because of your marginalization. Amber did that all the time in her mentorship, every single day, and I'm going to be grateful for it for the rest of my life. I think that before 2010's more visible resurgence of femme community, she was so on point in trying to develop rigorous intergenerational femme mentorship. I'm going to be 51 on Tuesday. That's how old she was when I met her 30 years ago. And she taught me so much shit that I had no idea what she was talking about, but I have really pulled out of my memory bank in the 30 years since around what it means to be a survivor who is not meant to survive and to age, and to be in a body that has worked really hard on the pole or in the streets or in the organizing line, whatever, and to grapple with desire and to grapple with still claiming sexuality through disability and aging. Some other things I really want to point out, like the whole centrality of this panel is about her lifting up desire as a fundamental revolutionary practice. I want to say that there are so many places in her writing where she's very clear that desire is not simple. It is frightening, it's monstrous, it's terrifying to grapple with. You fuck it up all the time. And I think there's also a huge through line where her work meets disability justice practice. I don't know if they ever met, but another incredible femme organizer who died last year, the great Patricia Byrne, who, is the thought leader who invented all of disability justice in large part. Patty talked all the time about like what it means to be in a body that's seen as monstrous, ugly, a defect, a sin, something to be destroyed. And to be like, I actually get to fumble my way towards not just knowing that I have the right to desire something, but towards what those desires are when abled, white, colonial capitalist world tells you that like, that's not real. Amber was really clear that desire is not just like, ooh, yeah, it's a self-care day, that it's terrifying to go after what you want and to keep going after it as it changes. I think I'm at the end of my time. I want to say that one thing that's interesting to me in recent times when I think about the influence of her work on revolutionary politics now, two things. One, I was telling someone recently that in the late 90s and early 2000s, everyone I knew who was a radical was also a sex radical. And it wasn't simple, but we were like, no, desire's in it. And I've seen this thing happen. And, we were all working class or poor, right? The dynamic that was there then was that like the middle class and upper middle class queers would kind of look down on us like, oh, you're these like slutty, weird, whatever, street involved, nasty, trash people. But we still got to have desire in the mix in a different way. Now what I'm seeing sometimes is there's been a flip where desire is seen as a luxury for the middle and upper middle class. And I've seen like some, not all, but like I've seen an upswing in younger queer and trans folks who are like, the world's so fucking terrifying, what do you mean desire? Right? And desire has also been marketed and repackaged as a thing that you can buy, right? Not the kind of bloody, oh my God, I don't know why I want this, but I do. This is scaring me. I'm having to be really honest, fulcrum of it. So I think a lot about in this moment where scraps are seen as luxuries, the importance and the difficulty of figuring out practices where we can figure out what we really fucking want. And I think a lot about Amber as somebody who was doing disability organizing as a working class femme AIDS organizer in the 90s and beyond, in the pandemicene, with this majority disabled planet of long COVID, PTSD out, multiply disabled folks, where the same ways in which we were figuring out, like, how do you use a dental dam when it sucks? How do you do harm reduction? How do you still claim desire in an epidemic? I feel like so many of us in disabled leftist world are figuring out how to maintain connection, pleasure, and joy in the Cripicene, with the forever pandemics that are going to keep coming. Is that it? Oh yeah, last up. Amber was a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and she was so out about it, and she was part of a 90s cohort of radical queer femmes, mostly, who were very out about their survivorhood and were like, this is actually a core of my politics. This is a place where my radicalism comes from. So I want us to remember that, and I feel like CSA is always everywhere and nowhere, right, in like political discourse a lot of the time. We're right in the middle of the mindfuck of Epstein being everywhere and yet being vanished. And Amber was very clear about her experience of surviving childhood sexual abuse had radicalized her, had shown her what power and oppression looks like, has shown her like what it means to fight your way back to your body. And she's not alone. I want to lift up groups from Generation 5 to Mirror Memoirs who also have been doing that work. But for myself also as a CSA survivor, I want to encourage everybody in here, survivors and not, to continually look at how CSA lifts up all forms of oppression in this world, and that some of the desires that we keep reaching to make the world that we want to come have to come from figuring out how to end it. Thank you.
I am so jealous. I think I might be the only person on this panel that never had the pleasure of meeting Amber. But as a working class Latina femme, as an academic, the influence of her work really permeates everything I do. Her willingness to talk about kink, sex work, desire made so much of what I do possible. I came of age sexually and politically in Hartford, Connecticut, and before I ever stepped into a college campus, I was a sexually active teenager. I had, thancfully, already experimented with BDSM and public sex and play parties, which we just called orgies, pornography, fisting, sex toys, daddy play, and I knew and I had partied with sex workers and folks who today would be called trans. In other words, I had this whole life. Sexual life before I ever encountered respectable lesbian sexuality, or what would later be called queer theory. Once I did make my way to college, I remember anxiously waiting in line to meet Audre Lorde, one of the only lesbians of color in print, and at her talk she was kind of railing against butch femme dynamics. And that it was merely replicating everything wrong with heterosexuality. That really stung. This was a time when desiring butches was seen as evidence of internalized heterosexism, or worse, lingering bisexual attachments, which I still have. For the white middle-class lesbians who ran the show, lesbianism was more of a political stance than a statement of desire for a certain kind of sex and a certain way of asking and receiving it. So when I encountered the piece, What We're Rolling Around in Bed With, Sexual Silences and Feminism, the very famous essay between Shetty Moraga and Amber, I was shook. I mean, here were dykes openly discussing the kinds of sexual fantasies that had most of the upstanding white lesbians I was starting to meet sort of gulp in feminist horror. Rereading that piece now, it's really clear that Amber was the audacious one, a kind of top femme, if you will, and the archive sort of bears this out. In a 2007 interview, Moraga really admits to being very reluctant to do this, stating, Amber was just very eager for a forum to talk about these very censored ideas, and with good reason, since the women's movement had been quite repressive in terms of discussions of actual sex. And in that piece, it's Amber who's really pushing hard on all the ways that our sexual fantasies fall outside the language of respectability. She writes, I don't want to live outside of power and my sexuality, but I don't want to be trapped inside a heterosexist concept of power either. This idea, right, that she was already thinking about how to activate tropes of colonialism, patriarchy, violence, the tropes that surround the scene of sexual encounter, particularly for those of us that have been harmed, including queer encounters, seeing those as resources for accessing pleasure. Amber was willing to go there to say what needed to be said. She was talking about sex work as a queer issue, as a feminist issue in the 1980s. And so now I'm going to put on my little organizer hat, because 40 years later, the decriminalization of sex work still generates scant political support amongst mainstream LGBT organizations. And I love the way this conference has so made that so central. the criminalization of sex work needs to change. Decriminalization is about the right to own your own sexual labor under capitalism. It's about bodily autonomy, an autonomy that's connected to our right to participate in BDSM, to abortion, to gender transition, to drug use, and to every other issue that involves the state legislating what you can do with your own body. Sex work is a labor issue, right? Work is work. But unlike so many other shitty jobs out there, sex workers are not afforded even the most basic forms of legal protection. And it is not just bad clients. Because the work is criminalized, sex workers are continually susceptible to the harassment and violence of the police. We know that female and trans femme sex workers, particularly those that are Black and brown and poor, are the ones surveilled and targeted the most. The criminalization of sex work is also connected to a host of other potential consequences that Amber care deeply about. Not only can you be arrested for doing your job, you can be denied housing, employment, citizenship, custody of your kids, or state benefits. You can have your bank account seized, your social media account shut down, if you're even suspected of engaging in illegal activity. Sex workers have always been the canaries in the coal mine for a wide range of legal assaults. The kind of shadow bans and seizing of bank accounts that have been leveled against pro-Palestinian activists were all first leveled against sex workers, and nobody paid attention. As more and more activist groups are labeled Antifa, we're all domestic terrorists now, we can expect to see more of these actions accelerated. Moreover, as educators, we know that our students are engaged in sex work in ways that have long-term consequences, particularly in a moment when our digital rights to privacy are shared with state operatives or sold to the highest bidder. But, sex work is also a care issue. For those of us that value sexual touch and perverse pleasures, I think addressing the stigma around sex work is also about addressing the stigma of those willing to pay the price for someone else's sexual labor. What might it mean to imagine that sexual touch might be something that those of us that are female or femme might also negotiate for? That those poorly equipped to navigate sex in the marketplace of normative desirability might also have a right to access? As a community, queers have long relied on our ability to negotiate the terms of our sexual and affective relationships outside of the structures of romance and monogamy and monogamous marriage. These are skills we learned from kink and sex worker communities, and it's time we thought critically and thoughtfully about the ethical exchange of sexual labor. What would that look like? Instead, today we have a wave of sexual panic traveling under the sign of trafficking in doctors' offices, airports, schools, and bus shelters. We see posters that invite us to spot the signs that someone's being trafficked. At the DHS website, they'll tell you that those signs include avoiding eye contact or social interactions with authority figures or law enforcement, lacking official documentation, appearing destitute, poor, or lacking personal possessions, or my favorite, references to daddy, which they equate with street slang for pimps. Today, trafficking discourse gets marshaled to train Karens in spotting and reporting suspicious behavior, and does nothing to encourage Karen to pay her immigrant nanny a living wage. It's not that human trafficking is not a real and urgent social issue. It is, but we need to understand it in relation to the extractive demands of global capitalism and the rights to mobility and movement. While some of this trafficking discourse might appear quite absurd, capable of ensnaring anyone who is poor, undocumented, unhoused, or distrustful of the state, that is precisely the point, and the consequences are wholly predictable. Most recently, we're starting to see a host of sting operations. I was an expert witness on one of these. Sting operations aimed at cracking down on trafficking and child predators, even as we have a rapist in chief in the White House. These sting operations have increasingly become ways to lure poor people into committing crimes and then setting them up, for falling for these police-made traps. As a labor issue, as an economic justice issue, as a disability rights issue, as an immigration rights issue, as a criminal justice issue, it's time for queers to commit to the criminalization of sex work. Amber would have wanted it that way. Thank you.
Oh no, I have all of these new ideas. What shall I do? I love that we're here in conversation and love with Amber. I first saw Amber at an organizing meeting for a big civil disobedience action we did after, it was at the Supreme Court after the Bowers versus Hardwick decision. And that was in, I guess our meeting and our action was in 1987, because that decision was 86. But I first truly met and talked with Amber about a week later when we were both in jail after being arrested at that action. So, and the arrest of Amber as part of our affinity group is on the cover of My Dangerous Desires. I'm just outside the frame, and that's just one of many times when there's lots of photographic evidence of events I was part of, but virtually none that I was there. So that's, I won't go more into that today, but that's an interesting phenomenon. Amber and I talked about solidarity, lust, visibility, incest, memory, and of course, class. We spent about 6 hours straight just pouring words into each other and gobbling them up. Decades later, I created an apartment in my house for Amber and Jen when Amber was becoming increasingly disabled, and we wanted so much for our house to become the radical left queer pervert feminist commune of our dreams. COVID and disability blocked that dream, but I love that in her last years, Amber had a secure home with a garden where she loved to sit and very, very laconically pick weeds. I want to pick up on an argument that Amber and I had over our almost 30 years of friendship about social construction and desire. This is an old school argument. Nobody really talks about social construction in those terms anymore, but that's how we talked about it when it began. And here's the gist. When we met, Amber immediately said, "Oh, you're a working class femme." And I said, "I don't know if I want to be a femme." And she kind of dropped her jaw in mocking disbelief and said something like, "Oh, really?" I'm telling you, I can see her sitting in our beloved NoHo Star later, in one of the later iterations of this argument, probably over the so-called Indian pudding, definitely not over ice cream, which she didn't eat because you can't eat ice cream with lousy, painful working class teeth. And she just really... I knew why she was skeptical of my skepticism. She was always poking around, probing to see if there might be some vestige of 1980s, 1970s even, feminist purity politics behind it, a demand to discipline my own desires and self-image into an androgynous refusal of femininity. And I'm going to actually go somewhere else here. Amber and I had a bunch of core things in common that shaped our desires and experiences of our own bodies. Working class, female-bodied, we both experienced sexual abuse within our families as children, love and desire masculine presenting, or in my case, sometimes androgynous women, and enjoy some of the very things that our culture tells us we are supposed to, indeed must enjoy. Pretty clothes, makeup, looking sexy, being feminine. But there's very little that pisses me off more than being told to do something that I'm already doing. So when I realized quite early on how much everyone was telling me to be feminine, I became very upset by that and frustrated. Amber just wanted me to put that aside and stop questioning myself, to accept that my desires are my desires, even though, of course, all of our desires are shaped by the world that we're in, the language and categories we have, the idiosyncratic matchup between our own body kinetics and morphologies and the norms we're supposed to reach for. Amber just wanted me to relax. I balked. We spent a lot of time talking about the nature of memory and desire, especially the relationship of those things to our class position and experiences as incest survivors. We talked about the practical day-to-day work of reconciling tension between honoring and trusting people's own accounts of themselves, our own accounts of ourselves and our lives, when we're all shaped and distorted by fucked up ideological systems like racial capitalism, misogyny, heteronormativity, and predatory family systems. This is familiar territory to a lot of us, this attempt to honor the feminist ethical principle of taking people as the experts of our own lives, what we might call having epistemic authority, while also taking seriously that our own subjective experiences are filtered through all these distorting lenses. But I balked then and I still balk, and here's where this has taken me. Balking at just, relaxing and accepting those desires. I can remember a conversation, also at NoHo Star, when we first really talked about incest, about what it meant to be violated inside our families, to be not safe in our own homes, to have our femininity make us a target. And I remember worrying out loud about how this might have etched its way into my desire, wanting to be wanted in my family, to be valued and let in on secrets by my older brothers, who were so smart and so interesting and people loved, and having that warped and turned against me, but also at the same time maybe internalizing that this was who I am, this is what made me valuable, attractive, desirable girl. Pushing against that as comfort, refusing to embrace it, and learning to trust my suspicion of ease as much as I trust my own desires, sometimes even more, was enabled by my long, drawn-out fight with Amber. She pushed me to articulate things that were at my edges, especially when we disagreed. And I pushed her. Amber, who had famously exclaimed at the Witch Homosexuality Conference with her then partner, Esther Newton, that people should, quote, deconstruct heterosexuality first, right? She was right about that, by the way, but she had to be dragged along a little bit when it meant leaving room for and returning relentlessly to deconstructing our own desires. So, do I have another? Yeah, I have a couple of more minutes, good. I want to talk, I want to pick up, I'm going to ditch most of what I wrote, but one more piece of what I wrote, and I want to pick up some things other people said. Amber was right when she said that desire has to be at the core of our revolutionary practice, but it can't be the easy received desires that are systematically, relentlessly sold to us by misogynist racial capitalism. We know that. Amber knew that. She talked about embracing having the wrong desires, being seen as wanting the wrong things all the time, right? And I honestly never wanted to be normal, but I have wanted some degree of comfort. And here's the gross word, mastery of my circumstances, especially because that was really not allowed as a working class girl. But knowing the deeply casually racist, sexist, nationalist fantasies that shaped me means that there's no innocent, pristine desire to pursue any more than there's a pristine self at my core. My desires are compromised because they are constructed in and through this mess. And I want to talk right now about how I wish so much that Amber were around to talk with about this whole Epstein insanity, in part because of the way in which people have reached over and over again for the word pedophile and want very much to spread who can get attached to that term, thinking that that's going to give us political purchase. So people are dying to have Trump tagged more as a pedophile and so on. And I want to insist that that term, that concept, has never been useful to us and is a complete misdirection from the beginning. I don't have time to go into this, but I've spent many, many years looking at the scientific history of the creation of this diagnosis of pedophile and the way that from the very start it was absolutely hermetically sealed from family sexual abuse. Anyone who had supposed easy access to children was normalized. The pedophile was the person who had to go out of his way to get to children. And as a result, queer men, gay men in particular, were attached with this probable taint. But definitely anybody who was going after some other man's property, i.e. children. And so I think that's one thing that I want to insist, that this grooming, this attachment, these two things come together, because for me, I was groomed to be a femme. And we were all also groomed, actually, to be prey in one way or another. And if we take a look at the whole culture that Epstein and his entire vast network of enablers and co-predators have displayed in public for years without ever knowing the specifics of the crimes, the culture of predation on young women, young girls, and in some cases boys, was there in full glory. So I think that Karen, who is being invoked to please, turn in some girl who maybe was trafficked. Mind you, you're looking at the girl, right, all the time. That's where the punitive control goes. And not being encouraged or taught how to actually pay her immigrant nanny a living wage. She's also not being encouraged to think about the predatory family systems. And in fact, now more than ever, we need an absolute revival of radical feminist critique and attacks on the family. We have to rework the family. The family is absolutely dangerous for so many people. We have to remake our own families in ways that are not dangerous. Amber and I had different feelings and strategies about that. It's always been very conflicted for me because I was both abused and deeply loved and cherished in that same family, and that creates this ugly tangle of desire that there's no such thing as unraveling that, right? The best we can do is constantly learn how to remake ourselves and find ourselves partly through our own gaze, partly accepting that self-consciousness is the price in a way for liberation if you're conscious and you're a woman who already has, all those layers of gaze. So it turned into rambling thoughts, but that's because I want to be talking to Amber right now, and I kind of expect her to come back in, and I would love it so much. And so it's always even a delight to be invited to think about what those conversations have been and what they've meant. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I also met Amber among many places here at Borshansky Auditorium at another CLAGS conference that Paisley Cura had organized as the first trans-identified ED of CLAGS, which was the National Trans Studies Conference. And it was quite international as well at that moment. We had Mauro Cabral from Argentina. It was a moment of war, unending war, and yet another moment of unending war. So much like all of my co-panelists, some of whom are friends and mentors and people why I'm alive or here, I still have hopes in the academy. So thank you for being who you are in your lives and your scholarship, because some days I just want to leave it all and go sell coffee, but I'm still here because of you guys. So I just want to say that we are at a moment not a moment, a continuing moment of unending war. As a scholar of migration studies, I point out to my students that this moment of ICE is not an exception, that it has historically been building, and that the US since the 80s has been a state that has been detaining, deporting people, and that we have to situate detention, deportation in the geopolitics of racial capitalism, that immigration, US immigration politics is related to regulating workers and laborers and the price and the ability of workers to negotiate their price and to keep captive bodies, all of which got really enriched and supported by my work with Amber and Queers for Economic Justice. Terry, who's here, was on the founding board. Jen, thank you. I want to acknowledge your work. My friends and everybody who's here, we have worked together, collaborated and written and met through. So I want to highlight two things. One is desiring change, which Janet has mentioned, is a great syllabus filler. And so any of BCRW's materials are great ways to demonstrate to students the radical potentials of queer feminist praxis. One of the last phone conversations I was having with Amber was after Sherry Moraga was being awarded the Lucius Leal Award at UCSB. And I knew they had met and they had written the piece that many of us teach. And I was asking Amber, I was like, Amber, what is the difference between an organic intellectual and queer activist? It's like, oh, darling, that's a big question. You know, I am making soup, but I'll talk later about that. We never got the chance for that. Margot and I kept dreaming about bringing Sherry and Amber on virtual medium and like revisiting what we were rolling around in bed with. That did not happen, but I did meet Sherry for dinner after Amber's memorial because she wanted to come but couldn't make it. And I asked her, how did the two of you meet? And Moraga said, well, it was Dolores and 18th. There was a vegan cafe restaurant, which is now a cafe, you know, by the Mission District. And that Amber was working at Modern Times bookstore and would walk down to that restaurant and order. And Sherry Moraga was working as a server at this restaurant and thought, who is this gorgeous, you know, woman with blonde hair reading stacks of books about communism? So she went up to Amber while Amber was reading The Romance of American Communism and said, who are you? And hence started their friendship. And Sherry said, you know, Amber is the one who helped me understand that my working class life was not because that wasn't who I was, that it was the structure within which I was located, and that I could claim that working class dykeness in the movement, right? And much like that, when I came into the paid LGBT movement after my graduate school work in the United States, it was the late 90s, and I worked for a national LGBT organization that shall not be named. And I met Amber and I said, what is this movement? Because I come from Kolkata in the 90s and grew up in the 70s and the 80s. And I grew up reading Marx and Marxism and thinking about Lenin's international move, Solidarities for Workers' Struggle. And she said, girl, darling, yes, we have to talk, you know. And we talked and organized. And I really, when I teach Amber Hollibaugh now, and thank you, Beck, for bringing desire and the messiness of desire, I often think about how Amber lived materialist analysis of desire, right? And when I return to the archives of Amber, I often think about how and when to sort of resituate Marxist feminism, you know, radical lesbian politics, question of desire and the family, and racial capitalism, right? These are very big constructs that I want to leave with at a moment of unending war and the intensification of masculinist logic around war, and where the logic of war and capitalism has surpassed any forms of identity politics or recognition globally, right? It's not like any form of queer recognition can offer us justice at this moment. And that is the legacy for me of Amber and Queers for Economic Justice, where, you know, when I was undocumented and I did not have work, Amber and Joseph called me while I was cleaning apartments and said, we are putting together the Beyond Marriage statement, and I know you're working on like bringing together queer immigrants and have a critique. I wrote this small piece in a South Asian journal called Why the Gay Rights Movement is Anti-Immigrant Rights, because the gay rights movement often only wanted to talk about partnership recognition-based laws for when it came to immigration reform, but never really wanted to talk about comprehensive immigration reform or pathways to legalization. And I think Queers for Economic Justice gave space to all of us, immigrants of color, asylum, refugee seekers, to put together a statement, around the Beyond Marriage statement, which was about beyond immigration reform. And we challenged the immigrant rights movement and the queer rights movement to talk through. And Amber was my mentor and advocate for that kind of work, right? And today I think, what kind of work do I want to be an advocate for? Because around that time, she was probably my age. And today I want to think, what kinds of scholarly, activist, desire, creative work do I want to be mentor for, where I can put my body next to at yet another moment of intensification of family capitalism, right? This government, this this president, for me is another model of factory farm, like the farm and the family producing billionaire capital and consolidating. So at this moment, I think Amber and class and queerness is very important. So please do contribute to CLAGS and Amber Hollibaugh seminars in the city series, because CLAGS has always been committed to this intersection of public scholarship and keeping queer theory free for everybody. Thank you. So I think we're out of time, correct? Or do we have time for a few questions? 10 minutes we have? Do we have time? So I think, yeah. Do we have time?
There's a keynote in here, Eli Claire, at 6 p.m. And it's 5:50, so probably you need a minute to set up.
Yeah, so what I could offer is, if you have questions, we will take it. Jen is here. We are all committed to working on a volume together, and the Amber Hollibaugh series will carve into that. So if you have a burning desire to ask a question, I will take copious notes of that question, and we will answer it in our scholarship and activism. Go for it. Okay, if not, thank you, everybody.